it is probably one of the most defining things about Amazon's success over the last 10 years is their ability to move product.
I think everyone is always going to look for like, well, what's the cheapest? What's the least expensive way that I can get this done?
I think there's a lot of innovation happening in the market that came off of we just can't compete to ways that maybe we can compete in a way that serves the customer that we are trying to serve.
One, two, three.
Welcome to the Smartest Amazon Seller Podcast. I'm your host, Scott Needham. I've been an Amazon seller for 11 years. I think when I started this podcast, I was saying I was an Amazon seller for 7 years. I've been doing this for a while. And my favorite part about the podcast is every once in a while, I get a guest that comes in that clearly has been around for a while, that has seen some of the evolutions and has built very interesting answers to what's possible for selling on Amazon. And I actually have with me, I would almost consider them a name brand seller that a lot of people are going to be aware of. They've done pretty well. I have with me Raj, the Chief Strategy Officer of Netrush, and Chris, their co-founder. Welcome to the podcast, guys.
Hi, Scott. Thank you.
Scott, thank you.
Let's just jump into Netrush's story. I mean, Chris, you started it probably, I'm going to guess like 10 years or more.
Higher.
Yeah.
Halfway there. Yeah. So Netrush, Brian Gonzalez and myself started it in 2006. So we're 18 years old.
Okay.
So this February we'll be 19 years old.
Awesome.
Started off just the two of us selling whatever we could get our hands on. And that was the origin story of how we got started selling on Amazon.
Yeah, I'm sure with all those years, just so much wisdom. And you guys have done some very interesting things. You have a lot of great partners that you bring them to market on Amazon. You have an advertising service. You bought Sellozo. That was an acquisition, and still growing that, pushing it, loving it. You are pushing what's possible with like logistics, and we're going to jump into some of the fee history and some of the changes that really makes 2024 feel very different than previous years. Tell us, started 2006. What happened the next 5-10 years that turned you guys into one of the largest sellers on Amazon?
Yeah, I think the biggest change from our early years was when we were early onto Amazon, it was wide open. There was a lot of dollars in terms of profit. As the market started to mature, dollars were turning to quarters were turning to dimes, and they really got to a place where there was a lot of commoditization. We kind of flipped the model and started to look at it from a brand's perspective. And so once we started to engage brands on how we can actually serve them as a seller in the marketplace, we created a whole different dynamic around the resources required and the scale required to do what we were doing. But we had the partnership, those brand partners to really be supportive of what we were doing. And so as a result of that, a very different model of chasing nickels to really thinking about how do we maximize the profitability for a brand. And if we did that, we actually benefited from that.
Of course.
But as a result of that, we had to build infrastructure to support that.
Yeah. And while the margins have decreased, like the size of what's possible is, what is Amazon's marketplace revenue since 2006? I would guess they did, 50 billion, and now they're like 500. So the opportunity is at least 10x. Yes. I think we're safe to say somewhere in that, in that space. I started my full-time selling was like 2013. And early on, there were like some other big sellers. Some of them aren't around anymore. But I heard on a few different occasions, Netrush. Those guys are sharp. They really help brands succeed. And like you guys had a reputation that was like, not big and flashy, but like successful. So I probably heard Netrush for the first time in like 2016, 2015. Tell us about Sellozo. Like, what was the advertising space like, and what was the opportunity, and how do you guys feel about that business?
Yeah. I mean, starting off, Sellozo is just a remarkable advertising tool. It's a AI-based bid automation, and the sophistication is incredible. And it's a central piece to our managed advertising service. We offer sellers, small, medium size, but also brands. It's the core piece of what's automating and driving success and performance for brands of all sizes. It was really the power of the tool and what it was able to do that we could build great managed services around it, and kind of execute on the ideas that we collaborate with our partners on. That it really is core to that.
There's some sellers that are like really big in advertising, or maybe like there's almost, I feel like advertising gotten so big in the Amazon world that's almost split it in two. Like there's this huge advertising conversation. A lot of agencies, service providers, tech, and so you guys are showing up to play with something like really sophisticated. And then there's the other side of the Amazon FBA world, which is logistics, content, product research. It's just amazing how many different skills or like lanes you need to be in to succeed. So, Chris, you were saying a little bit earlier that the advertising P&L has like had some years for refinement, and people have gotten a little bit better at optimization, making sure things are like profitable enough that they can spend ads on Amazon, but that not a lot of people have done this or are doing this on the logistics side. How do you guys see this part of your business?
Yeah, I mean, if we go back to 10 years ago, even further back, all the things that we're doing, including Sellozo, were in service of being successful on the Amazon platform. So we had to build these tools, these resources, and these assets to essentially be successful at the scale we operate at. As a byproduct of all that, we also recognize that we've built this infrastructure and have a really overview, get a wider view of all the pieces. And so when we think about marketing, if you're not thinking about how you're getting product to the consumer or FBA, all those pieces start to, if you're not thinking about them holistically and in integrated thought, then you end up actually maybe not in the place you were hoping to be, or maybe even realize where you could be. And so as we looked at the assets we had built for our traditional retail business, we started to realize that this is actually a larger conversation for brands beyond just what we're doing or sellers. And so when you take that analogy around the marketing side of things, we really do put that same lens across the transportation and fulfillment side of the business as an equal partner in helping sell products on behalf of brands. And so, go further into that, but the transportation fulfillment, look at Amazon. I mean, there's a reason why they're so heavily vested in that component of their business, is because it is critical. It is probably one of the most defining things about Amazon's success over the last 10 years is their ability to move product.
Yeah, no, I mean, I totally agree. We built a report around FBA, the fee increase history. And so I've actually spoken to a few journalists, and sometimes like it's going to sound like I'm beating up on Amazon of like, oh, this fee's increased here, this isn't here. And then I'm like, hold on a second. I've also got to tell you, FBA is the best logistics program in the world. Like what they accomplished to like have millions of products available, 1 to 2 day shipping. It is a phenomenal program. And if you can like, latch on to it just the right way, like, I mean, we know tens of thousands of people that have businesses through it. Is it perfect? No. And we can talk about that for a few hours if we wanted just to pick apart at it. But we've talked a little bit about advertising tech, a little bit about like logistics tech. What do you think brands today that you guys talk with, what's like what do you find most receptive? Like, what's what leads the conversation? What gets them hey, I'll jump on a meeting. Let's talk.
Well, at a high level, and then Chris will definitely have more details on the technical side. But it's been kind of amazing how often 3PL comes up in conversation as kind of the common denominator, whether we're talking about D2C success or failure, whether we're talking about international expansion, whether we're talking about even value-added services related to customer engagement, like things you can do to the package or inserts and other things. It always comes back to, my 3PL won't allow me to do this. Or there's some assumption baked into that. And 3PL has just been coming up again and again, and logistics and fulfillment capability as either the common denominator or a reason why something can't happen. And then you go back to what you said earlier, it's such a large part of the P&L to attack, both from growth and savings. That's been really compelling. And that's why it comes back as the common denominator on so many things.
Yeah, it makes me wonder if someone in 2010 would have started like, okay, we're not going to sell on Amazon. We're not going to be a warehouse. We're going to do everything possible just to be like the 3PL for Amazon. I know that there's lots of options today, but no one had that idea 15 years ago of just being there. And maybe you would actually need funding to do it really right, because these physical spaces are expensive. But it seems you got there's a few that have some name brand recognition, like Deliver and ShipBob, but they still don't fully get it. It's not like they're trying, they kind of try to create their own network of being maybe service the D2C, but servicing Amazon, and we're giving these brands, like you said, everything that they would want to be able to do. I don't know. I'm just thinking yeah.
And I think when you say the word "get it," what I interpret that to mean is where the influence intersection is with the rest of commerce or retail. And rather than logistics or fulfillment being just a stationary thing that is, you can't make any changes, it's static, you just got to work around it. Flipping it around and how can logistics and fulfillment be in service of the strategy? And you only get to know that by unpacking it and really asking questions about what's oh, is that really true? Can't we do that? What's possible and what's not possible.
That's interesting. Having logistics be a part of the strategy.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And transportation leaders being around the table. I think if I were to back up for a second, one of the lenses we like to use is the brand runner. It's the kind of a role that's emerged in the last 5 years of that jack of all trades in our space that's have to be a little bit good at content and creative and marketing and logistics and HR and finance. That brand runner has not really had sophisticated tools in fulfillment and logistics and supply chain to even ask the questions and challenge some of the assumptions like they do in advertising.
When you mean brand runner, do you mean a brand manager or the key person inside the brand?
Key person inside the brand that's having to take on and do a little bit of everything. Kind of like you said, that service providers have had to and even if we use Netrush as an analogy, we've had to be a little bit of a lot. We have to take on a lot of different capabilities and disciplines. There's an equivalent inside organizations that has to do that as well. They're the ones kind of dragging their brands into a digital future by piecing it all together. All of the disciplines that are related to commerce, which is a lot. And they're the ones that are going to benefit from having more tools and capabilities.
You almost describe a different part, like that. What you just described, could be you could actually just go back to general entrepreneurship of how do you get stuff done? What skills do you want to do, or can you build an answer to be able to solve this? For example, prior to 2010, that's when I built and launched Smart Scout. I never knew how to really build a sophisticated marketing page, kind of a landing page. Every business at some point kind of needs something. And I always envision, you're going to have to spend $15,000 and you have to get this and this and this. And my favorite part was getting very key service providers, like a copywriter, a graphic designer, and then like the web layout guy. And I was like, do you know what? If I just solve each of these, if I use a service provider to solve those, I got it done in less than $2,000. And not only that, if one part needed to get revamped, I knew who to talk to. And like a brand runner needs to build out different people who they can turn to like solve those different problems.
And the way to prioritize those things, one of the best ways we found is to look at the P&L and follow the money and where the opportunity and cost, both growth and savings. And when you look at that, I think you know this, that logistics and fulfillment is just a large chunk of that P&L.
Oh yeah.
And Scott, I'd add, as you think about when you started, we think about really two different, call it administrations at Amazon. In the earlier days, Amazon logistics fulfillment was subsidized. So all of us participants in the early days benefited from that a model that was being subsidized, quite frankly. It was we benefited tremendously from that. We get to where we're at today, and new leadership at Amazon has different requirements and metrics from Wall Street, if you will. And so we are living in a world, I think now, where Amazon has built this phenomenal machine, but someone's got to pay for it. And so I don't look at the fee increases necessarily as what has happened to us. It's a reality that we got away with for a long time. And this is my story.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. Every fee increase, every program change, I'm like, oh, they solved that corner case. I could see how that was just like not the business they want to be in. And so they economically force you to like behave a certain way.
And so that's created a new reality, as Raj described on the P&L, where you have to be thinking about your transportation and fulfillment options. As Amazon continues their journey into what they're doing, those fees are going to continue to increase, whether it's Amazon passing them on or it's just the nature of just the market. Is that if you're not paying attention to those and asking what can I do versus I can't do that, that's where we're having a lot of really interesting conversations. Is remove we can't do that to, well, what if the actual execution was in service of your strategy versus your strategy being in service of the execution. And so that's been a really, not an easy to get people thinking that way, but once you start thinking about that, the opportunities are really phenomenal. I
actually agree that I thought Amazon was subsidizing early on, and they're not doing it quite as much. Did they ever say that? Did Amazon ever say like, we're operating maybe at a loss?
Well, they were operating. I don't want to break up think there's a lot of components of Amazon, so you could speculate quite a bit. There was many years in Amazon's history where they didn't make money. Now they were making investments all over the place, so it's hard to pinpoint. But when I look at how much it cost us to ship, 6-7 years ago, it was a far difference between what it would cost if you went to a major carrier and did it. There's maybe not directly, but indirectly, I would speculate that was we benefited from that. It was how the flywheel was built.
Yeah.
And I try not to take credit for it. Like we benefited from that model, and we still benefit from it. But I do believe that the costs have to show up somewhere at some point when the what's being measured is different than what it was measured 10 years ago.
If you pay attention to Amazon's logistics, they care about like their cost of service, and that's why they distribute nationwide. And so that when someone, in California orders a product, it's not coming from New York. It's like the product's like a few miles, maybe 50 miles away and it's not that expensive. They've actually decreased that price.
Right. And that's an interesting aspect that when we talk about modeling and having the right tools, we talked early on about, and we can maybe go further in this if you want to, is around the new placement fees. What you just described is an outcome of, in the past, that product would have been shipped from New York to Seattle on Amazon's dime. That was how it was done. If there wasn't a product in the Northwest, that product was shipped for the consumer didn't feel that, and the seller didn't feel that. today those placement fees are there partially to address that issue, is getting that product in the right place. It has a cost to it. And so thinking about Amazon, thinking about that, how do they structure that in a way that you can't get away with shipping from New York to Seattle a lot of times.
And you know what? Placement fees, I had an initial feeling, and actually my feeling has changed a little bit for a few reasons. One, people pay them up front. So it just feels a little bit different. Yeah. And two, you kind of force sellers into a complicated decision. It depends on how many SKUs they have, or maybe even where they're at, where their location is in the US. Each of those actually changes it. So like, hey, if we do it like this, we save a few $1,000s. If we split it up, like, what does that mean on our labor side? Everyone kind of has like a complicated decision to make to like optimize. What's been clear from what I've seen is that you can optimize. You can avoid, paying like a lot. Maybe you need to like change some of your processes or like learn stuff, but you can. Like back to that P&L. Logistics can be, if we exclude the FBA fee and like all the other parts of running a brand logistics, it could be 5, 10, 15% of like total expenses.
Yeah. I think what we've learned over the last 18 years is when you step back and think about what Amazon's doing and you ask the question, why are they doing it? What's it in service of? You start to think about things in a way that, okay, how do we approach that now, knowing what we know, that there's a reason behind it that didn't just happen overnight. There was a lot of thought and process around that. And so once you have that, you start to think about how do you optimize? So the example of optimization is really, it's not a binary answer. I've made this choice and it will always be that choice. We now look across the Amazon network. There's more facilities that has to have product being transshipped. So if you send it into a single cross dock, you might take a whole lot longer till your product actually hits one of those FCs. So that's part of the math. If you're trying to if you're almost out of products, you might actually choose one path versus the other. Whether if you had an abundance of products, you might have a different choice.
Do you know if receiving times on average are faster if you split the shipment up?
Generally, it's dependent. The answer is it depends. It depends on the network. So how busy is the network at any given time? So we see variations is if you can get to the direct spot and it doesn't need to be transshipped, and it's a product that Amazon has made eligible to be sold while it's in transit, that's one answer you get that it would be quicker. If you're not eligible, your product's not eligible to be for sale before it was received, that's a different answer. But generally speaking, is that these are the criteria that you have to play on almost a SKU basis.
Do you know? I actually don't know if what makes it available or not before it's being received. Do you know?
I don't actually have the answer to that. Raj, do you have?
I don't have the answer to that of what product types or categories.
It is always a factor though. It's interesting, and sometimes I'm like, this may not look great if they could buy it, but it's not going to ship for a week. Like it's a complicated corner case.
I would speculate this, Scott, that a lot of it has to do more with the network at any given time. That might have more to do than I'm speculating than the actual ASIN itself. Mm-hmm. What's happening in the network at any given. I mean, Amazon's very sophisticated on what they're doing, which also requires from a seller or a brand or ourselves is to have sophistication to the extent we can around optimizing around those variables. We use the phrase a lot, it's in service of, is understanding what our strategy is or what we're doing by understanding what we're trying to accomplish. So all of those, it depends, is dependent on what we're trying to accomplish based on the scenario. So I'll give you an example is if we have something that has a whole lot of, say it has, let's just make up a number, 45 to 60 days of inventory, what we're going to do with that inbound shipment might be dependent on that piece of it is that it's in service of getting product in, but it's not urgent versus a product that is urgent. So there's pieces to it to understand is what are you trying to accomplish? And as Raj brought up earlier is if you don't have your transportation, if we use the brand runner as that analogy again, it doesn't have the right people at the table. How are you making these decisions, whether it's marketing or sales, if you're not including that part of the team? And how does that team know what to do if they don't understand the other part of it?
Yeah.
I would say the connective tissue there, and as obvious it might seem to many of your listeners, of course, is shipping time. So transportation strategy equals shipping time equals conversion. And that's how these things relate to each other. Particularly, you're talking about fulfilling yourself, you're talking about D2C. And that's just a very rudimentary way to start playing with the value equation. So if a brand runner now has some choices about shipping time and speed that they didn't know that they had, that means they now have some levers on conversion that they didn't know that they had.
Yeah.
Now they can start assessing value for what's worth.
There's a variety of things to be in service of. I think everyone is always going to look for what's the cheapest? What's the least expensive way that I can get this done? If you're like solely optimizing for minimum spend, minimizing expenses, what are some levers that you guys have found?
Well, maybe just use that example is if you think about it, and we're not saying cross-dock versus direct to FC, but if you are looking at, let's say you're determining, hey, it's cheaper to do one versus looking at your total cost of inventory. So do you have to have more inventory in the system to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish in selling those units through? If you're looking at just the unit economics of shipping, the placement orders, the placement fees, if you look at your total cost of inventory, which is another part of your income statement, would you actually make a different decision? And so those are levers where we're looking at, that's just an example of what is the total cost of carrying that inventory, which I know a lot of probably your audience, that's balancing that act of having too much inventory from a capital outlay. But a lot of times we get focused on this, what's the cheapest? Well, in the cheapest in the context of your total P&L, or just on the cheapest of trying to get the cheapest thing from point A to point B?
I think we like to know, even if we don't choose the cheapest, I think we like to know the theoretical minimum. You're like, okay, if I totally reshaped our things and if we were sending full truckloads to each of these locations, this is the theoretical cheapest way we can do this.
Sure.
And then you're like, well, maybe we don't want to do all of those things. It's kind of like, just a thought experiment of what is the theoretical cheapest versus what are we actually going to do?
We've had, just like in other realms of e-commerce, we've had to build the tools to bring it together to now have a sophisticated conversation about what's possible. And Chris can describe what we mean by that, but this is where a brand runner can now assess the trade-offs. And Chris will do a better job of describing what we mean by that.
Where is your product at any given point in order to make the decisions you have to make? So that's even just starting backing up is where we talk a lot about this with our partners is that are looking at moving to us from a fulfillment transportation is if you're not in a position where your logistics partner is adapting to your strategy, you're already in a bad place, right? So we hear a lot of times, well, we're not allowed to do that. We're not allowed to do this or that. Is that what we're doing is flipping that around. What are you actually trying to accomplish? And then how do we bring in the tools and what we do as a long time seller on the Amazon platform? What are we bringing over the top of that to accomplish the goals you're trying to accomplish? And so from a sophistication level, is part of it is just the rudimentary understanding of how it all works, from an Amazon building all the way back to a carrier picking up that product. You mentioned, Scott, I think you referenced this, was the package. What is the package? Are you at putting in the Amazon transportation network? You're talking about dim weights more than you're talking about weights at this point. So how are you thinking about what your package looks like? In the past, it was more about just what your weight. If you're selling an under pound item, it didn't matter. But if you're actually now focused on a dim weight, how would you rechange your packaging to support that? So it goes all the way from that moment of being sold in FBA all the way back to, is the product positioned to be in a place to be successful, both from a sales standpoint, but also hopefully from a profitability standpoint, assuming that is the objective.
I mean, 2024's fees have just been a big conversation. And I'd argue that we still don't know how it's going to settle. Amazon's pushed back this low inventory fee twice. We've only been around with this placement fee for a little bit of time. Holistically, how do you guys feel about, like, you know, this last year's changes and to where it's going?
Where's it going? Crystal ball. No, I think the trend has been clear. You know, and we talked about it already. Amazon's been playing catch up on how they want to monetize some of this stuff. Like all things Amazon, I believe the best way to think about it is every one of those changes is an opportunity to rethink some of the assumptions that we had before. And this is no different than that. I think I'll just emphasize something we said before, which is there's a whole heck of a lot of assumptions in this space, just because there hasn't been a lot of sunlight on fulfillment, logistics, transportation, the agencies folks are using, what their capabilities are, what's real and what's not. Even the definition of what does it mean to ship in 2 days? You know, something as simple as that, like, oh, does that include pick and pack times, include getting out of the door? We know when Amazon says 2 days, they mean you're going to get it in 2 days. And so if at least you take some of those fundamental things and work backwards, you can now, like, use fees and all the changes and kind of challenge all the assumptions all the way back. This is just a huge opportunity to revisit a lot of things that we just didn't have time to. Brand runners had no time. They're just kind of balancing so many things, especially in advertising space. I think this is a signal. It's like, now's the time to revisit all that.
I bet you a brand runner spends, 2 or 3 times more time thinking about marketing and advertising than they are thinking about logistics. Has any of the fee increases over the last 4 years immediately led to a price increase from from a brand?
I'm trying to think if you use the word immediate, like fee drops, price goes up. We normally, in anticipation of those fees, to the extent you can, we might be working with a brand to rethink what is it they need to adjust their pricing to reflect that new norm, or we might be adjusting prices ourselves. From a logistics standpoint, what's interesting about that question is when you think about shipping costs going up in the e-commerce world relative to the price point, a penny, a nickel, a dime has a profound impact on lower priced items. Obviously, the lower the price, the more impact that has. Is that what we're seeing is bundling and kitting. So how do they create a larger pack size to essentially to change the economics around that single shipment of an order, right? So that's part of that flexibility as we talk about is what do you need to do to change the unit economics of the products that you're selling?
Yeah. It feels like what that bundling and kitting is getting into, and this is like a side subject. I feel like the D2C world, average order value has been one of their North Stars for like years. Whereas Amazon, actually, that hasn't been a North Star, and probably to our detriment, not realizing that, like, well, if my average order value goes from $25 to $40, all of a sudden this fee increase doesn't hurt as much. My ability to advertise, I could spend, a few percentage points higher and be just fine. This is a trend like today, like talk to brands like, hey, how can you bring your average order value up higher to actually make Amazon work?
Yeah. And that's example of one way to do it, assuming the market embraces it.
Sure. Of course.
Yeah. The link between fees and price, I think, and I'm going to bring up something that's a whole topic in and of itself, but at Netrush, we work with brands in the traditional retail model that we talked about. We also work with brands that have their own seller accounts. And we see a clear trend that as brands have become more sophisticated, that they are taking on Amazon under their own selling account. And we help those brands as well. What that does is exposes them to a P&L in a way that they have never seen before. So they're able to make these trade-offs. In a traditional retail model, the retailer in the middle is a risk absorber in many ways. And brands may not be able to react in a kind of a very transparent way of like something happens, how should we react? But as more brands and larger brands, very significant brands are shifting to more direct model, I believe you're going to see more of them reacting to things like fees, maybe not just passing it all on price, but at least be able to play with the whole P&L in that transparency. And so the opportunity to do that is only just starting as brands are being able to see their full P&L. Larger brands, smaller brands and sellers that sell themselves, I think, do this all the time. They're having to manage fee increases with price.
Yeah.
But I think you're going to see it across the board.
I don't know why I think about this, but there were some years where I don't know if they always increase the fees on like February 19th, but like that's the day that's like embedded in my mind.
Yeah.
At least they've done it at least once. And we're like, the day that happened, like, prices increase, not necessarily prices increase, but like our floors of like, this is like our minimum price that we're willing to tolerate just goes up.
Yep.
And so I think what you're saying, Raj, there is that like the smaller sellers, ones that are closer to the P&L, are probably very reactive. Larger sellers might take a little bit longer to like, see big picture of this stuff. But yeah, it's interesting. Now that we're a few years, past COVID, past some of these, tough fees where like Amazon is forcing profitability, how do you think brands are going to like react to Amazon the next few years? What are some trends that are happening?
I think brands will take a closer look at the options that they've traditionally had with new options because of those price increases. The consumer is, for many years, none of us woke up and said, I need same day delivery. We just were told that that's what we wanted. And that's what it became. That's not necessarily the case for everyone. Is people aren't ordering for same day. They're actually pushing out the ordering time. And so I think as you start to understand who your consumer is, with prices going up, when I say prices, I'm not just talking about the shipping cost, but total cost of inventory, all these different things to be inside of a large network. What is the total cost? Mm-hmm. And Amazon's already adapting to this, even outside of their traditional model. But what are the different ways that you have to go to market in terms of logistics? My crystal ball says that there's going to be more options, even though it feels like there's less right now. And so brands are going to have to evaluate that. But I think there's a lot of innovation happening in the market that came off of we just can't compete to ways that maybe we can compete in a way that serves the customer that we are trying to serve.
Yeah, I think big picture, and I'm going to link this back to 3PL, but big picture, companies are going to continue to be valued by the value of their customer base. And if I were to bring that down to more day-to-day terms, getting customers, whether you acquire them on Amazon or not, and then holding on to them for as long as you can is going to be a game changer. And the brands that can do that will be able to succeed faster and grow more cheaply. Now, in order to hold on to a customer that is an omni shopper, that means you're going to have to be able to meet them on D2C. You're going to serve them on social. That's a 3PL challenge. You're going to have to engage them in new ways, whether it's inserts or offers that you can only do that are related to having access to the physical product. That's a 3PL challenge. I think all of your listeners know that Amazon has quite a bit of a limitation as it relates to great at acquiring customer, lots of traffic, not so great at building a relationship over time. In order to do that, in order to increase CLV in a meaningful way, and you mentioned it yourself that the AOV on D2C is much higher order value there, you're going to have to be able to even think about shifting them over and serving them in ways that they want to be served. All of those can be traced to 3PL capability. Or better said, those are going to have to be the measuring stick of what a 3PL of the future needs to look like. is to be able to solve the CLV challenge that's out there.
CLV, customer lifetime value.
Customer lifetime value. Yeah, in an acronym-filled space that we're in, I put some money in a jar.
There's some acronyms I assume people know, and then there's some I'm like, oh, you gotta be in the lingo. I actually like what you said about like, holding on to customers. I wish honestly that I could spend a year or two being a brand runner as you speak about a D2C. I just think I think it would change my perspective on everything. I talk to them, but being in those shoes would feel different. I say that as I have like a small private label brand, and I'm not like, thinking omni of like every possible channel. Thank you guys so much. Like Netrush, you guys have been around for a while. It's been great to talk with Raj over the past few years and learn about how you guys think and how you guys are operating and what you're building, what you guys care about. And I think it's kind of clear to those that like listen, that you got some passion about some of the weeds of Amazon.
Yeah, thanks, Scott.
Appreciate the time.
Okay, well, hey guys, let's wrap up the pod there. Thanks everyone for coming and listening, and we'll see you on the next one. Take care.
1, 2, 3.